everybody, welcome back to On the Grid. And since my original video released over a year ago on the All Sim settings, there have been many changes and updates made to most of the sim titles when it comes to force feedback and physics. As well, Fanatec firmware has had a few updates, so I figured it was probably time to do an updated version since many of my settings have changed in that time. These settings will include the DD and the CSL DD, and I didn't include the CSW or CSL Elite wheelbases since you can probably use the CSL DD settings as a reference point and make a few adjustments from there. These are my personal preferences and might not be suitable for everyone's force feedback taste, so I would suggest starting with them as a baseline and then tweak as you feel necessary. I don't usually really like an overall strong force feedback, so if you do like it lighter or stronger, then I would simply reduce the on-wheel force feedback versus in-game. And keep in mind that some sims like iRacing, RaceRoom, rFactor 2, and AMS2 do offer force feedback per car adjustments. So you should increase or decrease those as necessary because many of the cars do have very different physics and an overall feel. And I would highly suggest using Fanalab so that you can create individual car settings that can really save a lot of time in the long run and also take advantage of the other great features like dynamic force feedback, vibration controls, ITM, and so on. If you need help with Fanalab, I do have 2 videos that I've linked below that can help you get familiar with it. Also, one note to make is that when you see CM in brackets beside the CSL DD settings, that means that you need to have the base in compatibility mode, which mimics the CSW V2.5 wheelbase. That's really for games that don't have native CSL DD support. So again, I'm sharing these settings for games that I actually own and that Fanalab supports. So let's get into it. Alright, so first up we have Assetto Corsa. Now, Assetto Corsa, I'm using Content Manager to manage the force feedback. You can go in-game as well, but I use Content Manager because there is a couple of little things that you can use to that you don't have in Assetto Corsa. So a couple of things you want to make sure of. First, gain I have it set at 65, and make sure the invert force feedback is unchecked for Fanatec wheels. Filter at 0, minimum force at 0, and all the effects, I have those at 0 because I don't like to have those enhanced because those are canned effects. So keep those off. If you do have a weak wheelbase, for example, like a CSL Elite or something, that you might want to boost a few of those different effects like curb or road, but I really wouldn't exaggerate too much with those because they can give you unwanted details that really not getting the raw force feedback from the game. So as far as miscellaneous, enhanced understeer effect off, and you can use soft lock if you want, but you really don't need it in Assetto Corsa. The only thing I do have running in Content Manager is the lower speeds force feedback reduction. I do have that at around, you can average between 3 to 5 kilometers. So that's really when you're almost stationary that you really want to reduce the amount of effects that you're getting in your force feedback. And that's pretty much it that we have for Assetto Corsa. Now, for the wheel settings, I do have the sensitivity set to 1080, the force feedback set to 65, which matches the in-game settings that I do have, but I can increase and decrease as I feel necessary based on the wheel. The force feedback scale is going to be peak, and that will be the same in every game, so I'll not bring that up every time I'm talking about each setting on the wheel, so those will be the same across the board. The natural damper is at 20, natural friction at 2, natural inertia off, and the interpolation at 3 with the force effect intensity at 80. Any higher than 80, you can go 90, but any higher than that, if you have it at 100, you start to get a bit of that graininess in the wheels, so I'd rather dial that out and just reduce the force effect intensity. Force spring and damper all at 100, and then my multi-position switch at constant and brake force at 65. Now for brake level indicator, I don't have that on at all in any settings. And the reason I don't have that on is really that's more for if you're on a console or you don't have brake vibrations supported in the game. So if you're in console and you do want to feel that brake vibration, then you can add that on as well. Shock, I always have it off because it's really supported on the Formula V2 wheels or the 918 or BMW wheels. But I prefer to have them off because it's kind of just a vibration that I really don't care for, but you can have that on if you want. You can maybe put 40 or 50, that's enough. But I find at 100, it's a bit too much. So I do have it off in pretty much every game. Now for the CSL DD, the sensitivity is the same at 1080. The force feedback is at 100. And again, force feedback scale at peak. My natural damper at 15, natural friction at 3, natural inertia off, and interpolation, I dial that down a bit more at 2, so I can get a bit more detail coming through. So force effect intensity at 100, force and spring at 100, and the damper I have it running at 50 because it does really work well on the CSL DD, so you can pretty much run this at 50 and it works fine. Again, MPS and brake force at 65 and constant. So that's it for the Assetto Corsa settings. Let's move on to Assetto Corsa Competizione. Okay, so in Assetto Corsa Competizione, I have the gain in game at 60, the minimum force off because we're running direct drive wheels. The dynamic damping, when I'm using Fanalab, I use the in-game dynamic damping because I like it much better. I like the way it works better in-game, so I have that set at 100% and I have it off in Fanalab. The road effects again at 0, which like Assetto Corsa, I just don't like any of these canned effects. Everything else is pretty much at default. Now, when we look at the settings I run in-game for the CSL DD, I do have the gain up at 80%. That's the only difference between the two. And you will get a little bit of clipping, but it's not a constant clipping. So I'd rather increase the gain in-game to get more feedback from the game and then dial it down on my wheel if I need to. But I pretty much run 80 and then 100 on the wheel. So for the settings on wheel, the sensitivity I have it set to auto. My force feedback scale I have it set at 70. Now this is for the DD wheel. Again, peak for the force feedback scale. Natural damper at 15. Natural friction at 3. You can add a bit of inertia in game, but I much prefer to have it off. So I really kind of run that off in almost most games, except for maybe 1 or 2. The interpolation I have it at 4, just to kind of really soften out those spikes. And the force effect intensity, I have that running at 80. In Assetto Corsa because any higher than that, it just really does give too much graininess. So I keep that down. Force spring and damper all at 100. And then the brake force would be at 55 with MPS running at constant for this game. So that's the DD settings. Now for the CSL DD, sensitivity again to auto, but I do have the force feedback running at 100. And I do have it at 100 with 80 in game. And I can dial that down for certain cars that maybe might feel too heavy or too aggressive. The natural damper at 25 and natural friction at 5. The interpolation, I have that at 3. And then force effect, force and spring at 100 with the damper again, like in Assetto Corsa, I have it running at 50. And again, MPS and brake force the same, 55 and constant. So those are the settings I have running for the Assetto Corsa Competizione. Let's move on to Automobilista 2. In Automobilista 2, I do have the type set to default. I don't have it running on custom. Sometimes I'll play around with the custom settings, but I do prefer to run it on default because the default setting will give you the latest force feedback changes and updates that they make as they do release periodic updates. So this will give you the latest version. So I keep it at default. I do kind of go back and forth with the custom settings, but I don't know why. I find I always end up back to the default and then working with that. So for the Podium DD, I have the gain set at 65. The low force boost, I do run a bit at 6. The FX, I have it at 20. I think the default is probably 50, but I do run it at 20. So I just get a bit more details as far as engine vibration and so forth. And then the damping in-game from AMS2, I do have it at running at 20. And the menu spring strength, that really doesn't matter. It's more of a personal taste, but I have it at 6 because I like the wheel a little bit lighter when I'm in the menus. And that really only takes effect in the menus. Now, when we talk about the CSL DD settings, the gain is set at 70. I increase the boost to 10. So low force boost at 10, the FX at 30, and again, damping at 20. But I do have the menu spring strength at 0. I just kind of, I don't know why. I don't even pay attention to that setting really. But again, in these settings in AMS2, I prefer to run default and then just have my settings all done for both wheelbases on there. Now, for the on-wheel settings, the sensitivity I have set to auto, the force feedback at 65 for the Podium DD, 15 for the natural damper, 2 for natural friction. I have the inertia off. And then the interpolation, I have it at 3 with the force effect intensity at 90. 90, I can get away with it because it really doesn't have a lot of that graininess in this game, so I can get away with having it at 90. Force spring and damper at 100. MPS would be running an encoder mode if you do use it to increase or decrease traction control. And the brake force, I have it at 70, just because I find in Automobilista 2, running brake force too high or too low, like around 50, which is a default on your wheelbase, I find it just locks up a little bit too much. So 70 for me is a perfect sweet spot. Now for the CSL DD, you do have to have it in compatibility mode because they haven't added the native support for it yet. So this will mimic the CSW V2.5 when you load up the game. Force feedback, I have it set at 100. Natural damper, I have it at 25. The natural friction at 3. No inertia, interpolation at 3. And the force effect, force spring, and damper all running at 100. Again, encoder and 70 for the brake force. So that's for Automobilista 2. Now, for Dirt Rally 2, I have the exact same wheel settings in-game for both wheelbases. So once you calibrate your soft lock, or you do your calibration for each wheelbase, these are the settings I run on both. So for the self-aligning torque, I have it at 60. Any higher, I find it a bit too much, a bit too aggressive. So I keep it down at 60. I find that's a nice sweet spot, and I can adjust on wheel for my settings, my force feedback settings. I can increase or decrease them there. The wheel friction at 25, the tire friction at 40, and the suspension at 65. I do know some people like to run suspension quite high, maybe at 100, 120, but I like to feel almost a kind of an even feeling detail coming through the wheel. I don't like to have one or the other being too aggressive. I like to have it kind of clean across the board. So I do run similar settings within range, except for wheel friction. I do have that down at 25. So those are my settings initial. And then for collision, I have that down low. I don't like to feel, especially if you're on a direct drive wheel, I don't like to have it too harsh. So I do have that down at 8. And the soft lock, I have it at 50. So the way soft lock works is when you're, each wheel has its degrees of rotation, and each car has a certain limit of degrees of rotation. If you have this at 100 and you're on a direct drive wheel, it's going to be really aggressive once it hits that lock. So I do dial that down to 50 for both the CSL DD and the DD. Other than that, the steering force enabled and steering center force at 100, you can dial that down, but I do like the wheel to swing back to the center, so get more of that feel from the car. So that's my settings that I run for both wheelbases. For the wheel settings, the Podium DD and CSL DD, I do run them at 900 sensitivity. I know suggested is 1080, but I find I like to get a bit more detail in the center, so 900 works really well for me. Force feedback, I have it at 60 on the DD. The natural damper at 20, the natural friction at 5, inertia again off. Interpolation, I run that at 3, and the force effect intensity, I can have that at 90 again, with force spring and damper all at 100. The MPS, you don't use it in game, so I just leave it on auto, and the brake force at 70. For the CSL DD, you have to have it in compatibility mode because there is no support added unless they magically come up with some update to enable the support. I highly doubt it's going to happen now. Support is pretty much finished for the Dirt Rally game. So CSL DD, running at 900 sensitivity, 100 in the force feedback, natural damper at 30, natural friction at 10, natural inertia off. You can add a bit of inertia, but I just rather have it off in this game. The interpolation, I have it down at 2, and force effect intensity at 100. And again, force spring and damper all at 100. The MPS, auto, and brake force at 70. So those are my settings for Dirt Rally 2. Now let's move on to Formula 1. So for Formula 1 2021, on the DD, I have the in-game settings at 65 for the vibration and force feedback strength, the on-track effects at 20, the rumble strip effects at 10, and the off-track effects at 5. The reason I have those quite low is because Formula 1 can be really aggressive when you're hitting the rumble strips or off track, or you go off track. So I prefer to have those dialed down. You can increase those. That's a personal preference, but I personally like them to have them a little bit lower and have my vibration strength around 65. The reason I don't have vibration strength any higher, like at 80 or 90, is that because, again, Formula 1 2021 and all the previous series are really aggressive when you increase that force feedback a bit too high. So on the direct drive wheels, I find 65 works really well. And make sure you have the understeer enhance off, and the damper, I have that at 10. I find it works really well there. The only difference for the CSL DD is that I run the on-track effects at 25, the rumble strip effects at 15, and the off-track effects at 10. Everything else is the same. So I just bump up a few of those details on the CSL DD. For wheel settings, so sensitivity in game for the Formula 1 2021, the natural or the proper degrees of rotation is 360. So I have that at 360 on wheel, and then I have force feedback at 44, the scale again at peak, the natural damper at 15, and natural friction and natural inertia, I have them both off with the interpolation set at 6 to really smooth it out. And basically what the interpolation is doing is when you get those peaks, those really harsh spikes, what that does is basically rounds off those tips and just softens it out a bit more. Again, force effect intensity, I have it at 90. I find I can get away with 90 in this game and not have any graininess on the wheelbase. Force, spring, and damper at 100. The MPS switch set to auto. And the brake force, I have it at 75. So sometimes I do increase that to 80 just because I can navigate the brake a little bit better when it's a little higher, so it's not so sensitive and not locking up, because you can lock up quite easy in the Formula 1 games. So I keep that on there. As far as the CSL DD, I don't run this in native because they do have native support for it, but I don't run it in native support right now because there is a bug. Hopefully that's get fixed very soon, is that the brake and the acceleration are defaulting at 50%. So you can't play it. It just doesn't work. So until they fix that, run it in compatibility mode. Again, for the sensitivity, it should be at 360, but I find with the CSL DD, maybe that's something to do with this compatibility mode, or maybe that's something to do with the way the support is implemented right now. 360 doesn't work well for me at all, so I have to run it at 260, and I find I can turn in better, which mimics like the 360 on the DD wheel. So it could be something to do with the way they have implemented the support for CSL DD. Force feedback at 100, but I do dial that down sometimes to 90 if I find it a bit too much. The natural damper at 25, natural friction, natural inertia both off. Interpolation, I have it at 4. And you can even bring that down to 3, which is fine. The force effect, force, spring, and damper all at 100. You can also enable shock if you have the Formula 1 wheels, or if you have one of those Formula V2 wheels, you can enable the shock on that, which it's okay. It gives you a bit more detail on the wheel as far as vibrations. But again, I usually prefer to have it off, but you can run it maybe 20 or 30 on this game. So that's it for Formula 1 2021. Let's move on to iRacing. So in iRacing, a couple of things. One is the brakes, the force factor. Because I'm running the CS Clubsport pedals version 3, I have this set at 0.00, which on any kind of potentiometer pedals, you can have that at 1.8 or the default setting. But I found that having this down completely to 0, I'm getting a nicer range. I'm getting better feel from the brakes. So I do run that at 0. And for the force feedback, enable force feedback, use linear mode, and reduce force when parked, all checked. When you're working with the force feedback, you'll see here it says maximum force and strength. So if you click the actual title, maximum force or strength, it will switch from one to the other. So I prefer to run with maximum force and dial in based on Newton meters. So, you'll be playing with all different kind of cars. Just make sure you're using custom controls for this car at the bottom so that each car you can dial it in individually. Now, maximum force, you're going to be increasing and decreasing that based on the car that you're riding or driving. And every car in iRacing is very, very different. So the wheel force, you're going to set it based on the Newton meters of the wheelbase that you have. So if you're running the DD wheel, you're going to be running at 20 or 25. If you're running a CSL wheelbase and you have the boost kit, you'll run it at 8. So, and damping and minimum force, have those off unless you're running a weak wheelbase or a belt-driven wheelbase that you need to have a bit more detail coming through. So maybe you can increase the minimum force. That's the basic settings that I have running in iRacing. I know people do use the iRacing force feedback, but I just prefer to go with what's in game and build my settings based on that. Now for the wheelbase settings, the Podium DD, I have it running at 1080, the force feedback at 69, natural damper at 15. So I really bring that down because I don't want it to soften out too much of the force feedback in iRacing. So I have the damper down at 15, the natural friction at 8, and the natural inertia at 5. I find inertia and friction work quite well and are, kind of essential in iRacing. They do give you a better feel in the wheel because the wheel can be very, very light and you feel like you don't have a lot of detail in the center especially. So natural friction and inertia do help to kind of give a bit more of that feel in the wheel, and it does help with the oscillation. The interpolation, I have it at 6, the force effect intensity at 80, and force at 100, spring and damper off because they're not supported in game, at least at this point. MPS functions on pulse, and the brake force at 65. So brake force I do increase every once in a while. So if I'm running the Formula 3.5, I'll increase that to maybe 70 or 75. So just remember that when you're running the Clubsport pedals, the higher you increase the number on it, the more pressure you need to put on the brake pedal to have it active or to have it go to its full range. The lower you have the number, if you have it at 50 or if you put it at 30, a light touch of the brake and you'll be at full range. So just keep that in mind. For the CSL DD, I have the sensitivity set at 1080, force feedback at 100, and again, I do dial that down sometimes to 90, depending on the car that I'm driving. The natural damper at 30, the natural friction at 10, natural inertia at 5, and the interpolation at 6. So the interpolation I'm running at the same as my DD wheel. The force effect at 100 and force at 100, spring and damper off, and then again, pulse and brake force are both at the same as my DD. So that is the settings for iRacing. Let's move on to KartKraft. Okay, so in KartKraft, there's really not a lot of settings you're going to play with. Basically, you have your force feedback gain and your force feedback filtering. Your minimum force, I would keep that off unless you're running a very weak wheelbase and you want to increase some of those details. Force feedback dead zone off, 0, and force feedback invert off. Now, for my Podium DD, I'm running force feedback gain at 80% and force feedback filtering at 80% as well. I do find sometimes I need to boost that a little bit more to 90 or 100, but I found in these latest builds that I've been able to kind of start dialing that down to 80 or 70%. Now, for the CSL DD, the only difference is I've reduced the filtering to 60% or 50%. So I'm playing within 10% of those ranges. Now, for the wheelbase settings, the Podium DD, I'm running at 540. And I know you kart drivers are going to be cringing and going crazy, but I cannot run this at 180, which I believe is the correct degrees of rotation for a kart. I'm not somebody who's really experienced with karts, so I don't run it at 180. I calibrate based on 540, and I found that's where I'm most comfortable. I know when you watch kart races, like real life kart races, that there's very, very little degrees of rotation. So 180 would make sense, but for me, I just can't do that. It just doesn't work right. Unless somebody wants to spend hours training me, I'm just not ready to do that. So I run my sensitivity at 540 on both wheelbases, the force feedback at 50, the natural damper at 25, and natural friction at 5. Natural inertia off. The interpolation, I have it up quite high at 8 to really soften it out because I do find it can be quite aggressive. The force effect intensity at 80, force and spring at 100, and the damper, I do have it dialed down for the karts at 10. For MPS, you don't use it. So brake force, I have it at 80. Again, I find it's quite easy to lock up or quite easy to spin out if I'm putting too much brake pressure. So I find 80 works really well. Now for the CSL DD, the force feedback, I have it at 80. The natural damper, I have it at 30. Natural friction at 10. The interpolation at 6, because I don't need to soften it out so much because it is the Newton meters of the strength of the wheelbase of the CSL was quite a bit weaker actually than the DD. So I don't need to have dialing out of all that detail. The force effect, force, spring all at 100, and again, damper at 10. And auto and brake force would be at 80, similar to my Podium DD. So those are the settings that I have for KartKraft. Let's move on to RaceRoom. In RaceRoom, there's a couple of things. They've updated the force feedback not too long ago, and it is actually quite different than what it was previously. So if you haven't played it in a while, you're going to find it very, very different. Now, the way I have the settings in here would be force feedback obviously enabled, inverted force feedback enabled as well. And then I do have a force feedback multiplier plus or minus mapped to my button box so that I can decrease and increase that because it does have per car adjustments. Now, for the strength, I have it set at 100, but I do most of the times dial that down to 90 or 80 in game, because I can find that it clips quite a bit if you have it at 100, but I prefer to kind of maybe leave this closer to 90 or 100 and then dial down on my wheelbase as needed based on settings that I have saved in Fanalab. Linearity, you want to have that at 100. And as you go to the force feedback minimum force, you want that at 0. Maximum force, you want that at 100. The stationary friction, which is across the board for all wheels, at 50%. And as we get to the immersion, these are, again, similar to like canned effects in other games, but you can add a bit of engine vibrations if you want, or bump amplification, but I prefer to keep those off. The only one I do like to have on is the gear shift effects. It's just a personal feeling that I like. I like when I'm shifting and I can feel that feedback in the wheel itself. So that's one that I usually have around 15%. Up on the top, you will see the graph, so that as you're making the adjustments, you will see where if you're at clipping points or not. But it's okay if you get a bit of clipping, just as long as it's not constant as you're going through like sweeping corners, where if it's just you're turning a sharp corner and you hit the curb and you do get a bit of a clipping there, that's okay, but as long as it's not constant. For the wheel settings, the Podium DD, I have it set sensitivity to auto, the force feedback at 75, the natural damper at 20, natural friction at 5, inertia off. The interpolation, you should really keep this quite low. You can do it at 2 or 3, but I would not detail this up, or would not raise this up too high. So try and keep this as low as you can. The force effect intensity at 80, and again, force spring and damper all at 100. The MPS, or the multi-position switch, does function in constant mode, and the brake force, I found it really works well at 60. So for the CSL DD, similar, the sensitivity at auto, but I do have the force feedback at 100. And again, you can control per car adjustments, which I'll show in a second. And the natural damper at 25, the natural friction at 5, the natural inertia off, interpolation at 2 in this on this wheelbase, the force effect, force spring and damper all at 100, and the MPS, again, constant, and brake force at 60. Now, the great thing about RaceRoom is that you do have individual settings per car. So that's why I prefer to keep the force feedback in-game at 90 or 100, and on the wheel I have it set at 70, because I can dial down individual cars. So ideally what you want to do is have the game sending as much detail to your wheelbase as possible, and then you dial down the per car setting, because going from a BMW GT3 to the Tatus to a touring car, it is really, really different in what you're getting as far as force feedback. So I prefer to be able to adjust per car, and I wish every game would support that across the board, because it makes life a lot easier. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind, is that you can adjust the per car settings, and I would suggest using that rather than making so many different adjustments between in-game and on your wheel. So that is RaceRoom. Now, rFactor 2, much like KartKraft, there's very little things you can play with as far as adjusting your force feedback. So basically you have smoothing and car force feedback, or per car force feedback settings. The minimum steering torque and the steering effect strength, I would just leave them at default as is. But you do want to make sure that if you're running a Fanatec wheel, I would set the rotation limit mode to software, maximum wheel angle set to custom, and put the rotation angle of your wheelbase. So I would have it at 1080, and then make sure the range is set by the car. Then what happens is every car that you're going into, the degrees of rotation will automatically adjust based on that car. I used to find before they enabled this, it was just, I was always having issues with the degrees of rotation not matching in the car, and I would have to dial it in individually. Just some weird bug, but seems to be working pretty good, like having it set like this. Now, as for your force feedback, really all you're going to do is you're going to play with the smoothing. I find smoothing, you can go anywhere from say 5 to 15, 14, anywhere around there, depending on the car. If you're running a car that tends to be a little bit more aggressive, like a formula car, you might want to increase that. To running a car that's less, like a touring car, or not a touring car, sorry, or a GT car, you can run that a bit lower, and then dial in the specific force feedback for that car. For the force feedback settings on the wheelbases, the sensitivity I set to auto, the force feedback at 55, the natural damper at 2, And natural friction, natural inertia, I do have a little bit of both. So I have 2 and 2 for both of those settings. The interpolation works pretty good at 4. You can go to 3 if you want, but I find 4 works nicely. The force effect intensity at 80, I find in this game, if I increase that too much, like 90 or 100, I have way too much graininess going on in the wheelbase, so that just dials that out. Force, spring, and damper all at 100. The MPS does function in constant mode, and then the brake force at 60. For the CSL DD, you need to run in compatibility mode. And so I have the sensitivity set to auto, force feedback at 100. Again, use the in-game per car force feedback to dial that down or up. The natural damper at 30, the natural friction at 5, natural inertia at 3, and the interpolation at 3. Force effect intensity, force, spring, and damper all at 100. And again, constant and 60 for my brake force. But again, I do increase that. If I'm running a formula car, I might bring that up to 69, 70, somewhere around there. But for most cars, I get away with 60 and I find it works well. All right, for one final setting, I thought I would throw these ones in, even though this is not a sim, but many people will be trying to set up their wheelbases and looking to get ideal settings for force feedback. This is for Forza Horizon 5. So under difficulty mode, I run simulation, which will give you more detail. The difference between the normal and simulation is that normal has multiple layers of assists to help with people using controllers. But when you use a wheel, all those assists are disabled regardless of the mode that you select. So simulation, though, does give you a bit more responsive steering. So that's why I choose to go with that. Once you're done there, go over to advanced controls and you'll see all the dead zones. I have them set at default, 0 to 100, and then steering linearity, you run that at 50. So I haven't touched any of these. I keep those at default. They work really well. And then the only things you're going to start to change are once you get to vibration scale. So vibration scale, I have it at 0.4. The force feedback scale, I have it at 1 to 1, which is 1.0. So I wouldn't suggest increasing that because you start to mush out the force feedback. And if you dial that down, you're going to lose a lot more detail. So 1, and then work with your wheelbase to get those details. The center spring scale, I have it at 1. The wheel damper scale, I have it dialed down to 0.4. The mechanical trail scale, I have it at default, which is 1.0. The force feedback minimum force, I have it at 0.7. So I've dialed that down because, again, you're running a direct drive wheel. I find, though, if I bring that too low, maybe to 8 or whatever, I'm going to be losing too much detail and the wheel just gets really, really light. So it's good to have a bit of the minimum force. So I keep that at 0.7. You can go 0.6, depending on what you like. The force feedback load sensitivity. So this is as you're taking corners. I have that set to 1.1. So as you're feeling more load on the tire, so I want to increase a bit more of that detail, I have it at 1.1. The road feel scale, for now, I boosted that up. I've played with 1.3, 1.2, but I find 1.1 just works fine. And then the off-road feel scale, I've dialed that down to 0.8. And then the steering sensitivity, leave that at 0.5, which is linear. I love the idea that they've added road feel and off-road feel as separate sliders so that you can really dial those in how you like. As for the on-wheel settings, for my Podium DD, I have the sensitivity set to 900. This will be the same for the CSL DD. The force feedback, I have it at 60 on the Podium DD. The force feedback scale at peak, the natural damper at 20, the natural friction at 5. The natural inertia, I have been kind of going back and forth. I'm not sure whether I like it on or off, but try at 5, and then if you don't like it, just dial it out, just turn it off completely. But maybe 5 works kind of well. The interpolation at 3, the force effect intensity at 90, force, spring, and damper all at 100. The brake force, I have it set to 65. Now for the CSL DD, the sensitivity is the same at 900, the force feedback at 100, the damper at the natural damper at 25, the interpolation at 2, and then the CSL DD for the force effect intensity at 100. All right, so I hope you guys have enjoyed that look at all the wheel settings for the various sims. I know I haven't touched on a few of them that you might have wanted, like WRC 10. I just don't have that game and kind of been going back and forth on whether I want to get it or not. I might have to plunge and do that. And if I do grab it and I play around with the settings, I will post them in the comments below. I will post my settings for WRC 10 for both the DD wheel and the CSL DD wheel. So once again, guys, I really appreciate the support that you guys have been given the channel. I appreciate you guys watching these videos. I hope this just helps you out, get set up. And again, like I said at the beginning, these are very personal tastes. They're not going to be suitable for everybody, but I hope you find a nice happy medium that you can start from and work from there to dial in the settings to your taste. So as always, please subscribe, hit that like button, hit the notifications so you know whenever I release a new video. And until next time, take care.